Monsters. There are thugs, there are killers, and then there are monsters. But what exactly is a monster? Let's investigate. The word monster is derived from the Latin word monstrum, meaning an unnatural occurrence or an omen or a sign from the gods. It has close ties to the Latin monere, which means to warn or instruct. See, a monster isn't just a horrifying creature. A monster is a metaphor. It's a warning. It's a symbol for a social or political sin, something society has decided is perverse or dangerous. Plus, as you will see, monsters are unnaturally created. So, your ex-boyfriend is not a monster. He might be a real louse, but he's no monster. Hannibal Lecter, Ed Gein, and the shark from Jaws are all pretty terrifying, but they're not monsters either. No, monsters are created as a symbol for something that society has decided is unacceptable. This is the first in a series of monster investigations. Today's monster? The great granddaddy of all monsters in classic film, the vampire. So what does the vampire represent in cinema history? In classic films, the vampire becomes a metaphor for fears surrounding foreignness and forbidden sexuality, especially anxieties about seduction, corruption, and the violation of social boundaries. The mythology of vampires spans the globe and goes back millennia. For example, Lilitu was an ancient Mesopotamian demon who inspired Lilith in Hebrew culture that was associated with flying animals like birds. Lilith was considered a sexually depraved demon of the night, a succubus who stole babies in the darkness. Notice a pattern here? These early vampire figures are not just violent, they are sexually transgressive, nocturnal, and often outsiders to the dominant culture. We see similar characters across cultures such as Lamia and Empusa from Greece, or the Turkic Ubir. Vampire-like creatures appear in ancient Persia, Babylon, Assyria, China, Greece, and Rome, as well as cultures from around the world, including West Africa, India, and the Americas. The history of the word vampire is complicated. The word itself can be traced to Europe in the 18th century, and some believe it derives from the Turkic word ubir, which means witch, but there's no consensus on this. The method of creating a vampire varies widely from demonic possession, improper burial, disease, etc. But the first modern stories and poems about vampires begin in the 18th century. Poems like The Vampire by Heinrich August Ossenfelder from 1748 and John Stagg's The Vampire from 1810 began a trend. John Polidori wrote the short fiction piece The Vampire from 1819 as part of the same writing contest that produced Frankenstein. And this was followed up by a serialized Gothic horror story called Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood, which is attributed to writers James Malcolm Rymer and Thomas Peckett Prest. But of course, the most famous vampire work was written in 1897, Dracula by Bram Stoker. Dracula set the stage for our modern understanding of the vampire and everything it represents. Now let's move to cinema history. The very first vampire film is thought to be a Hungarian lost silent film called Dracula Halala, or Dracula's Death, from 1921. This was not considered an adaptation of Stoker's novel, but the first adaptation of Dracula was Nosferatu by F.W. Murnau from 1922. This was an unauthorized adaptation, and Stoker's widow sued, resulting in a court order to destroy all copies of the film, though obviously some survived. Finally, the first authorized adaptation of Stoker's novel was the 1931 Universal classic Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi. The movie was based on a stage play called Dracula, written by Hamilton Dean and John L. Balderston. The Universal picture was originally set to star Conrad Veidt and then Lon Chaney, but Veidt feared his English was not good enough for talkies and Chaney died suddenly. Some other actors considered for the role were Paul Lukas, Paul Mooney, Chester Morris, and Joseph Schildkraut. Lugosi was not originally considered for the role, though he'd play the Count on Broadway, but finally got the part, earning only $500 a week for 7 weeks of filming. Lugosi was so iconic in the role that the image of the vampire in the zeitgeist is still his face. Go find vampire Halloween costumes and you will still see his visage nearly a century after he played the villainous Count. So let's take a minute to consider what vampires represent in classic film. As a monster, what metaphor for some social ill do they embody? Often you will have an old man with a heavy accent from a distant country, an outsider, who only emerges at night. He is frequently aristocratic, living off inherited power, occupying castles and estates, and feeding without producing anything himself. And what do they seek? Virgins. They seek young, sexually pure women. They want to penetrate flesh, exchange bodily fluids, and leave their victims weakened, confused, and changed. This is not subtle. The vampire does not merely kill, he corrupts. He spreads something, and that something is framed as both foreign and sexual. The fear of the outsider and the fear of exploitation collapse into the same figure. So if this is a coincidence, it's a strange one. Let's start with Dracula from 1931 because this is the template. Bela Lugosi's Count is explicitly foreign. He speaks with a thick Eastern European accent at a time when Britain and the United States were experiencing rising anxieties about immigration, degeneration, and undesirable outsiders. Dracula moves into England, infiltrates the domestic sphere, and targets young women, Lucy and Mina, whose purity is repeatedly emphasized. His power is not brute strength, it is seduction, hypnosis, and control. The women become passive, drawn to him against their will, their sexual behavior suddenly viewed as abnormal or dangerous. Lucy's crime is not disobedience, it is desire, and for that she must be destroyed. Now look at Nosferatu from 1922. Count Orlok is less romantic and more explicitly monstrous. He arrives by ship, bringing rats and plague with him, echoing real-world fears of immigrants as carriers of disease. His body is exaggerated, uncanny, and grotesque. This is not a man who passes easily as human. He is marked as other. Entire towns fall ill simply because he has arrived. The vampire here is not just sexual, it is epidemiological. The message is blunt. Foreign bodies bring contamination. Moving forward to Dracula's Daughter from 1936, the metaphor becomes even more explicit. Countess Zaleska struggles with desires she describes as uncontrollable and shameful. She preys on young women, gazes at their bodies, and speaks openly about urges she wished she could eliminate. The film frames her vampirism as both tragic and pathological, something to be cured or destroyed. Again, the horror is not murder. The horror is forbidden desire. Next, let's discuss Hammer horror, because this is where subtlety dies and subtext starts wearing a low-cut blouse. Beginning with the horror of Dracula from 1958, Christopher Lee's Dracula is no longer a distant aristocrat. He is physical, aggressive, and overtly sexual. The biting becomes much more erotic. The women respond with visible pleasure. There is no longer any ambiguity about what the vampire represents. What had once been whispered through metaphor is now shouted through image and flesh. He is sexual awakening framed as corruption. Hammer's films repeatedly show women becoming more sexually expressive after being bitten, and this transformation is treated as both intoxicating and catastrophic. Peter Cushing's Van Helsing is not just a hero, he is a moral corrective. His job is to reassert social order by violently repressing liberated sexuality. The Hammer films arrive at a time when censorship was loosening and sexual norms were changing, and Dracula evolves accordingly. He becomes more explicitly predatory because society's anxieties about sex are no longer theoretical. They are happening. Now let's talk about Interview with the Vampire from 1994 starring Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, because this is the moment when the vampire stops hiding behind metaphor and starts to explain himself. Cruise's Lestat is seductive, cruel, and unapologetically predatory. He doesn't merely feed, he recruits. He selects Louis not just as a victim, but as a companion, an act that resembles grooming more than attack. Vampirism here is transmitted through intimacy, persuasion, and emotional manipulation rather than force. Lestat promises eternal life, freedom from social rules, and escape from moral consequence. And then there's Claudia. Claudia is the most disturbing vampire in film because she makes explicit what classic vampire stories only implied. She is an immortal child, frozen, forever in a prepubescent body, but endowed with adult intelligence, rage, and desire. The horror of Claudia is not that she kills, it's that she exposes the deeply uncomfortable logic at the heart of vampirism. Eternal predation upon the young. The film doesn't deny this, it leans into it. Interview with the Vampire reframes the vampire as an addict and a narcissist, someone who feeds to fill an emotional and existential void. Sexuality is still present, but it is tangled with power, control, and dependency. Feeding becomes an act of domination disguised as love. The vampire doesn't just cross boundaries. He rationalizes why the boundaries shouldn't exist in the first place. What's crucial here is that the film no longer presents vampirism as an external threat. It becomes internalized. The monster now narrates his own sins. The audience is invited to sympathize, even as the film refuses to absolve him. And this brings us to the so-called romantic vampire. Even in modern iterations, the core metaphor doesn't disappear, it just puts on better lighting. Take Edward Cullen from Twilight. Edward is an ancient being trapped in a teenage body. He enrolls in a high school, surrounded by minors, and becomes romantically involved with a 17-year-old girl. The film frames this as a tragic romance, but structurally, it is still the same story. An immortal predator drawn to youth, purity, and virginity. Edward repeatedly emphasizes his desire to restrain himself. His virtue is defined by not giving in to his urges. This is classic vampire logic with a modern sheen. The difference is not the metaphor, it's the moral framing. Where classic films say, this desire is monstrous, modern films say, this desire is dangerous but beautiful if properly controlled. The vampire didn't change, society did. The romantic vampire is not the end of the vampire metaphor, it's the evolution. By the time we reach films like Twilight, the vampire has learned to speak the language of restraint and self-control, but the core anxiety remains unchanged. Desire framed as dangerous, intimacy as predation, and eternal beings drawn irresistibly to youth. The vampire has gone from villain to tragic anti-hero to romantic lead, but he is still feeding on the same fears. So what does the vampire represent in classic film? Across decades, cultures, and film movements, the vampire remains remarkably consistent. He is ancient, He is foreign, he targets the young, he violates the body through intimacy, and his victims are often blamed for their own corruption. The vampire is not merely a monster, he's a warning. He embodies society's fear that outsiders will infiltrate the home, seduce the innocent, and spread corruption through intimacy rather than violence. He reflects anxieties about immigration, sexual liberation, and the loss of control, especially male control, over women's bodies and desires. This does not mean that the filmmakers were consciously crafting sociological essays. Monsters don't work that way. They emerge organically from cultural fear. And the fears surrounding the vampire, foreignness, sexuality, contamination, were very real in the early 20th century. Over time, these meanings evolve. Vampires become romantic, then sympathetic, then heroic, but in classic film, the vampire is still what he has always been at his core, a metaphor for what society fears entering the blood. If you enjoy this sort of content, classic films, old monsters, and digging up the meaning buried under celluloid, I've got some merch that helps keep the lights on. Shirts, designs, and goodies inspired by classic cinema, made for people who still think movies should mean something. Every purchase directly supports this channel and helps me keep making more deep dive classic film content. And if you can't spend a dime, that's okay. There's another way to help. Like the video, subscribe, leave a comment. The algorithm is a cold, unfeeling machine, a monster of sorts, and it only understands engagement. Every click proves that this kind of content deserves to survive. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for our next exciting investigation. This is the Classic Film Detective, signing off.